Hello, hi, and welcome. If you're new here, my name is Sarah, and this is Wicked Reading. So, the thumbnail is a little bit of an exaggeration. I don't have a favorite book yet for every single subgenre of horror, but I do have a confident 9 for you today. My goal is to make this an ongoing series, update with new favorites, find favorites in different subgenres that I haven't really explored much of or don't feel that I have a favorite in yet. So, this is going to be an ongoing series, and we're going to start off with these. So first I wanted to talk about folk horror. So in this subgenre, you can expect books that really focus on folklore. A lot of these books tend to have pagan themes going on, but it could be any type of folklore. What I really love about folk horror is there's so many different cultural folklores out there. There's Irish folklore, Native American folklore. Folk horror is such an expansive subgenre that I really enjoy, and I definitely want to explore more of, but my current favorite folk horror is The Vessel by Adam Neville. This is a very short book. It is a novella, but this book was so fantastic. In this story, we are following Jess, who is a struggling single parent to her daughter, and she works as kind of like an at-home nurse, and she gets a new client, which is a very reluctant, unhappy older woman that really doesn't want her around. But one day, because of circumstances, she has to bring her daughter to this woman's house to take care of her for the day, and her daughter and the woman just click. They are having a great time. They're hooting and hollering, laughing with each other. They love each other. So Jess is kind of off the hook from being pretty much assaulted by this old woman for the rest of the day, but she starts to notice some really strange artifacts around the old woman's house, and the story just kind of slips into creepiness. This book was so cinematic, and while I was reading it, I was like picturing everything so clearly in my mind. We would have like cut to scenes. It was such a cinematic experience. And then I read the author's note, and it turned out that was a goal of Adam Neville's in writing this. He wanted to kind of merge just typical narrative with screenplay in a way and make that cinematic experience, and he nailed it. I loved this story so much. It's just so atmospheric and creepy. That's kind of another thing you should expect with folklore, is kind of like a very atmospheric, potentially slow burn. This is a novella. I didn't find it to be very slow burn, but with atmosphere, I feel like slow burn can be a very typical additional aspect, but I loved this one. Thoroughly recommend it. I gave it 5 stars. It was in my top books of 2022, and the ending was just like, mwah, I loved it. So next up, I wanted to share my favorite possession horror books. So with possession books, these very much kind of revolve around religion, specifically Catholicism, and the storyline is typically following someone who is possessed by a demon, and there's typically an exorcism involved in some sort of way. A lot of times we have like a priest character or whatever the religious figures are. We typically have one of those characters. Possession is one of the types of subgenres that I really like, so I actually have 2 recommendations for this one because they both have very different tones. So the first one is A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. This one was so good. This is one of the earlier horror books I read when I started getting into reading horror. I've always been a horror lover, like a horror movie lover, but I really didn't explore the horror books for a little while. But this was one of my early horror books that I read. Oh, I loved it. I loved it so much. It's kind of a speculative possession in which we have this young girl who is potentially possessed. Her mother thinks it's just a mental illness crisis, but her father is convinced it's a possession. And then we are actually following the POV of her younger sister. So we are seeing everything unfold through the younger sister's eyes. And this family eventually ends up inviting a documentary crew to their home to pretty much document and record this exorcism that their daughter is going to go through. So I really enjoyed this. It has a speculative twist to it where it's very much, is it possession or is it mental illness? And I just thought it was so good. The ending had me in tears. I had a great experience reading this, and I highly recommend it. And then another possession one that I wanted to share is My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. This one just has a different tone to it. I feel like A Head Full of Ghosts is much more heavier, and while this one has heavy aspects to it, it also has this 80s nostalgia twist, and I don't know, it just had a different tone. But this one was much more kind of slow building because honestly, a lot of the focus is on our characters. So we are following two best friends, Abby and Gretchen. They have been best friends for their whole lives. They met when they were very young, and they are just hanging out, living high school days, and something happens where Gretchen gets separated from their friend group, and she comes back not quite the same, and it is believed she might be possessed. So we are actually following Abby's POV. So again, we're not following the possessed person's POV. We're following it kind of indirectly through a different person's eyes, which I really like, because I think that that's like a really scary aspect to also just watch somebody go through something and not really understand what they're going through. Anyways, I digress. We follow Abby's POV, and it's really following her trying to figure out how to help her friend. This one isn't as horrific, in my opinion, as A Head Full of Ghosts, but there were still some scenes in here that had my skin crawling, especially towards the end. I thought that the horror aspects were very, very effective, but they're just like farther and fewer in between. This also felt a little bit more campy in a way. Just, I really, really enjoyed this one, but at its core, it's really circling around female friendship, which I love and appreciate that theme. So I absolutely loved this one. It was an easy 5-star for me. Next, we have Apocalyptic. Apocalyptic is one of those stories that I feel like can be approached in so many different ways. It can be following the timeline of the apocalypse starting, it can be in the midst of the apocalypse, or it can be kind of post-apocalyptic, or it could even be speculative, which is exactly what this is. This is The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. You'll notice there's a second Paul Tremblay on this list. I really love his writing. I can't wait for his new releases. But this is a speculative apocalyptic story. So it's very psychological in a lot of ways. So in the story, we are following a little family of two fathers and their daughter, Wen. They are doing a little family vacation at a cabin in the woods, and they're the only ones there. I think it's like off season or something, when they are suddenly approached by a group of strangers. The stranger goes up to Wen and he says, "None of what's going to happen is your fault. You haven't done anything wrong, but the three of you will have to make some tough decisions. I wish with all my broken heart you didn't have to." So this book was so surprising to me. It is not a straightforward apocalyptic story by any means. It very much so is psychological based. So then this family pretty much becomes hostages of these strangers, and you quickly start to learn the motives of these strangers, and it's just a very, very interesting approach because it was just so psychological for me. We are dealing with a family who is in this very terrifying situation, but the people you expect to be the villains aren't so like cut and dry, black and white villain, and everybody is motivated by what they feel to be right. And there's also not a clear ending. I will say the ending is very, very ambiguous, which I like. I enjoy that. So do not expect any questions to be answered by this story, because it will not be. You will end up leaving this book with more questions than you had starting it. But I just thought that the writing was so fantastic. There's this amazing juxtaposition written within the story where these people are living through this extremely traumatic situation, and then they would just kind of think of a memory of a very mundane activity of them making pancakes for breakfast, or just these very mundane everyday things that they didn't really think much of, but have so much more meaning and so much more happiness in them when you compare it to them in their current situation. So I just thought this was really great, really fantastic. You're here for the writing, you're here for the speculation. It's not a clear-cut story, but it was so effective on me, and I loved it. I do want to read more apocalyptic stories. That is a subgenre I don't feel like I've explored too much of. So if you have any apocalyptic horror story recommendations, please leave them down below. If you have any recommendations for any of these subgenres, leave them down below. But moving on to slashers. So this is another one. I have two for you because they have very different tones, kind of. They're similar in a lot of ways, but one is truly just a straight up slasher, and that is The Cotton Candy Massacre by Christopher Robertson. If you love cheesy, gory, B-horror films, this is the slasher for you. In the story, we follow a group of late high schoolers approaching college days, and there is this carnival in their town that has been shut down for decades because something very wild happened, which you open the story up with right away, but something super crazy happened back in the day. I don't know what year, but back in the day. And then fast forward to the 80s, and the carnival is under new management and is reopening. So this group of friends decide to go to the carnival, and they're having a good time, fun time, whatever, and then all of a sudden there's all these killer clowns and massacre ensues. This is another story that is extremely cinematic. It took a second to get into because you really blip in and out of a lot of different scenes. It's kind of like very whiplashy in the beginning, but once I settled into the writing style and how quick we were going to be moving, I just really had such a great time with the ride. I will say it is on the longer side because we follow so many characters. Like, there's a lot of characters, but you also care about all of the characters, so I feel like the length is necessary, because what good is a slasher if you don't care about who's dying? So I just really loved this one. The body gore was so effective for me. It was very like skin and blood related, and it was just, some of the stuff was gnarly and wicked, and I totally ate this up. There were so many fun cheesy lines throughout. Again, if you like a B horror film, this reads just like that. So then another slasher I have that doesn't lean so far into slasher, but it is a slasher. It just takes a little while to get there, but a lot of the beginning is much more psychological, and I loved it. Curse of the Reaper by Brian McCauley. This book, I'm so glad I read this. I didn't even hear about it. Like, I had no idea this existed until Amy from Amy Noel Reads had this as one of her book club picks, so that's why I read it, and I'm so grateful because I loved the story so much. So in the story, we're following our main character Howard, and he played a very iconic slasher in this 80s movie franchise called The Reaper. And I loved the aspect of the 80s horror films because there was a lot of homage to Michael Myers, Jason, Freddy, like all of those iconic 80s slasher characters. This book is pretty much a love letter to them, and there's so much nods and homage to those iconic characters. So if you're into 80s slashers, this is like for and written by 80s horror slasher lovers. So there's a lot of that going on, which I really loved that element. But the story kind of gets started where it is now present day, and the studio decides they want to reboot this series. And obviously Howard assumes that he is going to be the Reaper again, but he is older and much later in life, and it becomes known that he is not the person that they want to play the Reaper in this reboot. They actually want to hire this younger actor that is kind of going through rehab and is freshly recovering from addiction, named Trevor, who played in like a family sitcom when he was young. So it's like this childhood actor that kind of needs a new breakthrough to come back into this cinematic world. So Howard is not happy about that, and Trevor's kind of like none the wiser, but that's kind of the premise of the story. I have to say, with Trevor and the addiction storyline, I think that is probably what won my heart over the most with this book. The way addiction is talked about and is shown in this story is just so authentic. I have to believe that Brian McCauley knows somebody or is somehow, you know, attached to addiction in his life, in his indirectly or otherwise, because it was just so like amazing. It gave me goosebumps. I was crying at parts, and it was just so beautifully done and so respectfully done. And so the addiction aspect to this book was so amazing. I don't think I've ever read a horror book that ties in addiction, and if I have, I can't remember it because it clearly wasn't done very well, but just having that element in there really made me attach so much more to this story. I thought it was so well done. Not only that, but the 80s movie slashers, I clearly love when books feel like or have an 80s twist to them. What is so fun about this one is every other chapter or so, we get the screenplays of the Reaper movies, and I just absolutely love them. They were just like so fun, so cheesy, so tropey, but all in a totally self-aware and respectful type of way. Some of the titles of these movies, you can just tell that they're kind of poking fun, but also loving the iconic ones. So we have like Night of the Reaper, Part 8, Moon Reaper. So that's like Jason Goes to Space, Jason X, you know? Or there was one where it was like the Seed of the Reaper, Seed of Chucky. It's just a really fun time to read those. So loved this one. And again, the slashing happens, but it kind of happens late in the book. This was sold as Scream meets The Shining, and I do think that is a very appropriate comparison, and those are two things that I love. So there's that. So then next I wanted to talk about body/survival horror. So body horror is kind of like a tough one because I feel like well, that's not true. There's never no, but very few books I've read are like kind of strictly body horror. I guess maybe like splatterpunk, which is something I've never explored. That would maybe be just body horror. But I feel like most of the time you have a lot of other elements going on, and the body horror is also just really good in a book. So I wanted to pick one that was kind of nonstop body horror, but is also kind of like a survival horror, and that is The Troop by Nick Cutter. I freaking love this book. If you're gonna read this book, I highly, highly, highly recommend the audiobook. The narrator does such a fantastic job. I feel like he totally fits the feel, the grittiness of this book. So this story, we follow this Eagle Scout group of young boys, and they are going to this kind of like isolated island off of their mainland that they are going to camp for the weekend to get, you know, badges and all of that with their Eagle Scout master or whatever, Scoutmaster, there you go. So then while they're there camping, they stumble upon a man who is described as the carrier of a bioengineered nightmare, and absolute chaos breaks out from there. This is so gross, honestly, so effective. There's a lot of bug horror going on, a lot of description of gross body stuff going on. It was so well done. The writing, like Nick Cutter's writing, I have a vlog of me talking about this. I read a few lines from it, and he just has such an interesting way to describe stuff. He uses a lot of metaphors. He's just really, really good at creating an image in your mind, and I found his writing to be very unique, yet it felt like kind of old school vintage type horror where it's very gritty. I will say, warning, there are 2 parts that deal with animal cruelty, and in my vlog I tell you exactly where they are if that is something you want to skip. I personally skipped over those parts. I knew going into it that those parts were coming, so I skipped over those, and I don't feel like I missed anything, but also at the same time I don't feel like those scenes were for nothing. I do feel like they served a purpose, which for me, I don't want to read it still, but I appreciate that there was a reason for it. Okay, so anyways, there's that warning. What I really, really loved about this book so much is it is mixed media. So we have parts, like we have actual printed ads in the book, so you definitely still want to have the physical book, but I did a lot of immersion where I was following with the book but listening to the audiobook. Such a great experience. And then we have like newspaper articles talking about it, and it was just like really, really great. There is evidence logs, there are interviews after the fact, so we also kind of jump back and forth between what is happening on the mainland and what might have happened post this event on the island, and then the kids currently going through what is happening on the island. But just so well written, so engaging. I had a great time with it. Obviously highly recommend it. Next, I have cozy horror. So this is kind of, I feel like, a newer thing that's happening where it's kind of up in the air what cozy horror is. It's a little bit subjective, but for me, cozy horror is a book that is just like not meant to be super horrific. It's not meant to gross you out. It's not meant to scare you, but it uses a lot of horror icons and imagery like werewolves or witches, and it uses these icons but applies it to a cozier atmosphere. Maybe the stakes aren't as high, or maybe there's a lot more themes going on. Like, what really matters is what these things kind of emulate and what the themes are behind that. In addition to, I know a lot of people say Darcy Coates is cozy horror, and while I haven't read from her yet, I think the idea behind that is that her books are just very tropey. You kind of know what to expect going into it. It's just cozy. You know what the outcomes are going to be. It's following a solid trope that we're used to. So those are kind of like the two main ideas I feel like behind somebody saying something is cozy horror. I feel like certain authors have really kind of made a name as being authors within the subgenre, such as Grady Hendrix. I feel like a lot of people lean his stuff more into cozy horror. Another one is Darcy Coates, like I said. And then one of my personal favorites, Rachel Harrison. I feel like she has become the queen of cozy horror, at least for me. I really, really love her stuff. I don't love everything, but in general, a lot of her stuff has had very high ratings for me. This is my favorite Rachel Harrison so far. Such Sharp Teeth. This book I was really surprised by because it was another one I wasn't really interested in because I've never really been into werewolves, and I don't know, I like werewolf movies, but I have a tough time with creature features and like stuff like that in books. I just don't know that it's gonna be the same for me, but creature features are something I have to read a lot more of too. But this was so great. So in this book, we follow our main character, Rory, and she is living in like the big city, has like a huge important job, whatever, but her sister is pregnant and she needs help. So our main character decides to leave the big city and go back to her small town to help her sister out. While she's there, she goes to a bar, and as she is leaving the bar, she's driving away and she hits something. And when she goes to check it out, whatever it was is gone. But then she ends up getting attacked. And the next day she wakes up in the forest and something is off. So you learn very quickly, I mean, it's on the cover, it is a werewolf story. She does become a werewolf. And while that is kind of like the setup of the story, I feel like much more of the emphasis is on the character and kind of the themes behind what a werewolf and what being forced to become a werewolf kind of insinuates. It has a lot to do with our bodies and losing control of our bodies, or having a say in what happens to our bodies and stuff like that, or having stuff be done to our bodies. It has a lot of subtle themes around that, which I really, really loved. I just really enjoyed the characters. Again, it's very cozy. It's not like, there are like transformation scenes and stuff, but it's not like anything terrifying. You're mostly here for the character, and while she's kind of going through this transformation, she's also reliving some past trauma that is very interesting and kind of ties into that. There also is like a side plot romance, which I actually really enjoyed. I don't love having a romance unexpectedly. I like to go in knowing that there's a romance. I didn't know that there was in this one, but it was not the main point of the story. It was very much a side plot. So I really appreciated that it didn't take over the story, and I thought it was really cute and sweet. So I just felt like all the elements were very well balanced in the story, and I really annotated it quite a bit. There's a lot of really good writing in it. It's also very funny. There's a lot of like moments where I was laughing. It's pretty witty and funny, and I had a great time, and it is still my favorite Rachel Harrison book that I've read. So there's that one. Okay, next I wanted to do Supernatural. So I feel like Supernatural is kind of tricky because I also don't know if like Haunted House would be like a different one, but it also is supernatural / like paranormal. And also this is different from Possession because I feel like Possession is specifically linked to demons and Catholicism and exorcism. So in these ones, that's not necessarily the case. And I have two for this because I do. So the first one is The Day of the Door by Laurel Hightower. I read this very recently and I really, really loved this one. So this is actually in a very recent vlog. I'll have it linked down below. I read it for Escape the Readathon when I got it in a Nightworms package, and it was just so good. So it is on the shorter side. It's only 211 pages, so it's a nice quick read, but it kicks off right away. So in the story, we're following a family that is 4 siblings and a mother. But the story opens up where there's this intense situation where the mom is acting literally crazy and pulls the oldest son into a room. The door closes and the son dies in that room. And it's kind of an area of contention and like a gray area of what actually happened in the room. And then we follow the siblings as they're grown up. They all have very different relationships with their mother, very different feelings and thoughts about what happened that night. We mostly follow the POV of the son named Nate, and then he has the two sisters. So we mostly follow Nate, and he believes that it's just all bullshit. His mother's just a narcissist, manipulator, but the mother's trying to convince everybody that what happened wasn't her. She was taken over by a ghost, by an entity, and she had no control over what happened. But they also still don't really know what happened because everything was just ruled accidental at that time. So there comes a situation where this TV crew decides that they want to do an episode on this family, and the mother, Stella, is saying that she will finally tell everybody what happened. It's a tell-all. She will share her story. So because of this, they all gather back at the house, and from there, potential paranormal stuff happens. What I really loved about this book is the themes at the core of this are very much around childhood abuse and growing up with a parent that is volatile, manipulator, narcissistic, but then there is this supernatural twist, so it kind of makes some stuff a little bit more speculative as well. So I really love that. I love when there's a speculative aspect to it. I love that there was a ghost hunter twist to it. The themes really spoke to me. So this is very much kind of like supernatural, but there's areas of speculation. So yeah, I love this one. So then I wanted to include one that is very much kind of leaning a little bit more into the haunted house aspect, which is also another thing I need to read more of. I don't know what it is. I don't know that I like haunted house most of the time. I haven't had great luck with haunted house stuff. I have a lot of haunted house books, honestly, but for whatever reason, I never feel drawn to them. But this one I read early on and I really enjoyed it, and that is The Shining by Stephen King. In this story, we follow a family called the Torrances, and the father gets a job to actually be the caretaker of the Overlook Hotel, which is in a very isolated mountainous area. So they actually close down for the winter because it's so dangerous around there, nobody can get to it. So they do close down for the winter, but they need a caretaker, so Jack, the father, takes on that position. So then this little family of 3 move into this hotel, and also Danny, the son, has a strange ability. Okay, we'll just say that. He has an ability. And then when they get to the hotel, it's very atmospheric and slowly stuff starts to get more and more weird. And what I think I really loved about this is that the haunted house, in this case a hotel, the hotel almost has a presence of itself. It's almost its own entity, and I feel like that's what made it super effective for me. It had less to do with just like a single ghost or something haunting whatever, and it had more to do with this overarching cumulative atmosphere that this hotel really just like sucks in and takes on, you know what I mean? So I just really was surprised because I was nervous because I don't read a lot of old horror, so I was nervous that it really wouldn't like resonate for whatever reason. And I will say, because of when it's written and because it's Stephen King, there is unnecessary use of racial slurs, so be aware of that. So I did technically actually give this 4.5 out of 5 because of that. It's just like, it's not necessary. I understand when it was written, but I still don't want to read it. I don't care when it was written. I don't want to read that. But nonetheless, I still think it was very effective, very atmospheric. It's very psychological in a lot of ways too. You might notice I have said the word psychological a lot. I like when there's like psychological stuff going on. I like my mind to be messed with. So that will work on me every time. But I actually teared up at the end of this. I don't think that that's a typical response, but I did tear up at the end of this because of what one of our characters had to witness. But I really enjoyed this and I was surprised. Okay, so that brings me to the final subgenre that I'm going to talk about today. And this one is a little bit more niche, I guess. There's a lot of books that fit this category that I want to read more of because it's just one that anytime I hear that it's this type of subgenre, I immediately want to read it. So this is Frankenstein retellings, or any books that are inspired by Frankenstein. So this tends to have a lot to do with kind of reanimation, but not like in a zombie way, you know what I mean, in a Frankenstein way. It tends to tie in a lot of nature, which I really enjoy. So for that, my current favorite Frankenstein inspired story is Our Hideous Progeny by C.E. McGill. This is a story that follows our main character Mary, and she is actually the great niece of Victor Frankenstein, and she is a scientist, you know, as much as she can be, because this is taking place in the 1850s specifically. This is taking place in the 1850s. So she's as much of a scientist as she can be during that time. She works very much behind the scenes alongside her husband, who is a legitimate scientist who actually is able to give lectures and write papers. And she will actually draw the pictures for him, along with really helping his research behind the scenes. But we follow this couple, this scientific couple, and Mary eventually finds these letters talking about her great uncle Victor Frankenstein and the experiment that he did. So she decides she wants to take on the same experiment, because her and her husband are actually going through an issue with the scientific community and not being taken very seriously. So they think that by pursuing this experiment, it will really shoot them into a successful career and really make good names as scientists for them. So this is very much like historical slow burn. I want you to know that. It takes a little bit to get going. She doesn't even find the letters until like a third of the way into the book. A lot of the beginning of the book is exposition of us exploring this early scientific community. They are pretty much the scientists that are first into paleontology, and I really love that aspect to it. I love reading about science in such a early set of discovery, in such an early time of discovery. I think it's so interesting. So I love that. So you do have to kind of have some interest, at least in paleontology, because it is very much emphasized in the beginning of this book. Another thing that I really loved about the story that I didn't necessarily really expect is the female rage at the core of this. It's very subtle, especially in the beginning, because women had to act like ladies and couldn't, you know, seem unhappy in any way, but it's very kind of subtle. And then there's this chapter that I was actually listening to this on audiobook, and I was listening to the chapter while I was grocery shopping, and I was just like, yes, get him, girl, you go. It's a very great moment of female rage coming out, and I loved it. So I really, really enjoyed this. Honestly, this was going to be a 4.5 for most of the story, but the author's note was so stunning, gave me chills, was so beautiful that it got a 5-star from me. I really, really loved this one. And with Frankenstein retellings, I didn't really say, but I feel like a lot of times they tend to lean into historical because of obvious reasons, because Frankenstein is very historical, but not all of them. I have a few other books that I want to read that take place in more modern day. There's a lot of Frankenstein retellings on my TBR that I need to get to, but this one was so great that I had to include it on today's list. So that is going to be everything for today's video. Like I said earlier, if you have recommendations for these subgenres, leave them down below. There's still a lot of other subgenres that I really want to explore. Books exploring the occult. I also want to try to find some niche subgenres like claustrophobic horror or found footage horror. So again, if you have any recommendations in any of those, let me know. If you have a specific horror subgenre or like niche element within books that you want me to explore, let me know. I am working on lists. Trust me, it just takes a while to create these lists because you got to read the books to make the list, and then you got to read enough of the books and find good books to be able to recommend them, you know? So it's an ongoing process. So any recommendations help. If you made it to this point in the video, leave me a black heart emoji down below so that I know. As always, thank you so much for spending some of your time with me while I sit down and talk about books. If you haven't yet, please give the video a like, subscribe for future content, turn on the bell notification, all the fun YouTube things that help your girl out, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Bye!